The rain doesn't seem to have dampened the enthusiasm of the two little athletes at all. It's just the parents that aren't nearly as excited about the idea of sitting out in the rain and watching it, but it'll be a great day. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 is where we're going to begin. The last 2 weeks we covered 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. We talked a little bit about the introduction. We talked a lot about Thessalonica, some of the challenges that were being faced there, some of the attributes and things about the church itself. We talked a little bit about the city, its location, its importance in history. And so in this particular chapter, Paul's going to get really personal really fast. And we're going to see one of the central themes of this book come out. And the central theme, one of the central themes that we're going to be addressing in this is Paul defending his ministry. And it might very well be easy for us to look at this and find this as a very isolated kind of circumstance. And this is one of the things when we're reading Scripture, I think it's very important that we look at the text first and foremost, first, from the standpoint of what was it saying to the audience? What was Paul trying to get across to the audience? What was his motivation in writing? What was his purpose? What was his intention? What did he want them to understand? And what we're going to see is that this chapter largely revolves around the theme of Paul establishing his ministry, Paul defending his reputation. We'll talk about why, but Paul was under great attack. Paul was under great criticism and scrutiny, and he's defending himself. It's very easy for us at this point to say, this is a chapter about Paul defending himself to the church at Thessalonica, and it really is just that. But I think I want to encourage us, anytime we're reading Scripture, but especially today, to read deeper into that. What does this say to us today? Where do we find timeless nuggets of truth that we can apply? And I think that you'll agree with me, if we'll look at it carefully, that there are some very, very important lessons for us to learn today. When we read Scripture, understanding how it was received is important. Understanding how we should receive it is also important. And so this morning I want us to be focused on both of those and hopefully walk away with it today, a better understanding and maybe some new learning that we didn't know before. We're going to try today to get down through about verse 10. That's our goal, which means we'll probably get down through about verse 3. But we're going to begin by reading this first section, starting in verse 1. For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without result. On the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. For our exhortation did not come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you, as a nurse nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you, not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers and sisters, working night and day so we would not be a burden to any of you as we preached God's gospel to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. There is a Shakespeare quote that comes to mind for me here, and it is, "Methinks the girl doth protest too much." And in that particular quote, the idea behind it is, if someone is giving a very, very stringent defense, if someone is giving a lot of evidence, if someone is really trying to reiterate a point, there's one of two things going on here. Either there's a false accusation, or a person is desperate in trying to set forth their defense. And both of those are worthy of some consideration here. Paul is going to, in this chapter, give an outrageous number of reasons and rationales for his defense as a minister, his motives, why he was coming to the people, the attitude, the way he treated them, the way he went about his business. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that he was being accused of just those very things, of not being gentle, of not being kind, of not having good motives, of not having a proper heart, of not having good priorities. And so he's having to answer each one of these. He's having to go back and give a defense of each one of these as we go along. One of the overriding themes that kept coming back to me as I'm reading this chapter this week is a passage that comes to us in James, the 4th chapter. In James chapter 4, James, the half-brother of Jesus, writes to the early Christians, and he says, "Let not then, therefore, many of you be teachers." He says, be careful about rushing in to positions of teaching. Be very cautious about that. He goes on to say, because you will incur a stricter judgment. There is a really profound burden that should come on the shoulders of those who stand and present the gospel to others. Whether it be in a teaching, whether it be in leading a journey group, whether it be preaching, whatever. If that's something that is done from a lay position or something that's done from a paid position, a professional role, it's something that has to be entered into very, very carefully. And Paul here is going to give us an enormous number of ideas, practical teachings about how those who go about teaching should govern their hearts, should guide their minds, should prepare themselves, the motives that they should use, and the way that they should go about it. There's a lot here that is very, very timeless. This chapter is going to revolve around external and internal challenges of teaching, preaching, of leading in a church setting. Externally, whenever somebody steps up to teach a class, to preach a sermon, to lead a Bible class, to lead a journey group, that person is putting themselves in the crosshairs of criticism. It is always going to be the case. It is a natural thing that we're always going to have critics. There are always going to be people who want to poke holes and punch holes and pick little tiny nitpicky details and find some way to dissuade people, find some way to tear people down. I don't know why that is true about us, but it's true. And Paul is going to talk about external challenges of teaching. But the thing he's really going to focus more on are the internal challenges of being in that role. And the things that we have to govern and watch and guard ourselves against. Pride and status and accolades and doing it for the right reasons, doing it for the right motives. Because he's going to recognize something that we continue to see is true today, that there are many people who aspire positions of leadership, whether it be a formal position as a paid preacher, or whether it be a lay position as a Bible class teacher, and they pursue these from the wrong heart. They see the people who are up in front. They see that they're getting accolades. They see that those are people that are getting, attaboys and pats on the back. And they're saying, I want that. I want that kind of recognition. I want that kind of approval. And those are internal challenges. Anytime we step into a role of leadership in the church, we have to check ourselves. Are we ready for the external challenges that'll come? Are we careful about the internal challenges that are true? Roger. Yeah. That's the reason that you've got to be careful. Yeah. If you desire to do that, because if you have to pass on error, you're going to get judged for that because you're responsible for a group of people, not just yourself. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is the truth that we are burdened to share, and if we don't do that, whether by negligence or innocent error, we're still responsible for perpetuating a falsehood that is dangerous. Carl.
Jeff, could I suggest that maybe the criticism that you alluded to, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a messenger of God.
Sometimes it is.
Ever call and put us back in our place when we seem like we're getting looking lofty, when we can really go off in a wrong direction. So maybe that criticism is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a place for that, Carl. I think you're absolutely right. There is a good and healthy criticism. You know, the Proverbs are replete with little, sayings about a brother who speaks truth to you. You know, there is something to be said that's very, very important about a person who lovingly puts an arm around you and says, you need to rein this in, or you need to check yourself, or did you mean to say this? You know, you said this, and let's look at what Scripture really says. And I think it's very important that we have that kind of dialogue with each other. It's important that we do hold accountability, and we do so from a loving and gentle standpoint, that we do so with the right heart and intention. But a proper criticism is actually a really good thing. There was an old saying, it's much better the friend that stabs you in the front than the so-called friend that stabs you in the back. And I've always said, I would much rather have a person walk up to me and tell me something they disagreed with than walk over to their neighbor and tell them something they disagreed with. It's much easier this way. Yes?
Enjoy it, but I still don't feel like I don't like to want your attention, so it's never.
Well, I think if we, and you say it well, Jen, if we start from the position of there is a need, and we feel that the Spirit is prodding us, you could fill this need, then to push past our own insecurities about that is actually a very healthy thing that causes us to grow, and that's a good thing. I also think it's good for us to always have a healthy level of, I don't want to say unease, but there should always be a seriousness. There should be a sense of burden that should come with teaching. And I think that's something that keeps us humble, keeps us in the right place. Sometimes that's a matter of discomfort just because we don't like to be in front of people. Sometimes that's a reality of acknowledging what we're doing and how really important it is. Paul's going to say the very first evidence that he has to defend himself with are the actual people to whom he's writing. They are his defense. And he says so in the first section here. You yourselves know, brethren, that coming to you was not in vain. But even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in as much conflict. He starts by saying, for you yourselves know. Now, this is one of the important themes that's going to be revisited throughout this chapter and really throughout this entire book. There are two different voices that he's going to be addressing as he writes this letter. There is the voice of the faithful Christians at the church there at Thessalonica who are hungry, who are growing, who are striving, who are working hard. These are the ones that he talks about, when he says that word of you has spread all through Macedonia, it's spread all through Achaia. He says, we don't even need to say anything. You guys are out there, you're doing it, I'm proud of you. There's this group that he addresses, and those are the Christians, and they're doing the right thing. They are not the problem. When Paul is defending his ministry, when Paul's defending his work, they are not the problem. In fact, they are the witnesses. They are the evidence that Paul is properly motivated and is teaching truth. But he's addressing this other voice. There's a secondary voice. There are people who are in the church that are not really part of the kingdom. There are people who are in the community who don't have anything to do with the church, who are bent on trying to degrade Paul's ministry, trying to tear down Paul's reputation. And so Paul is writing to the faithful Christians, and he's saying there are some in your midst, and there are some in your community who are out to tell you that I am not preaching truth, that I don't come from a right heart, that I have a selfish motive, that I'm just in it for the money, that I'm just here to make myself a big name and a big status. And so in addressing the Christians who are agreed, Paul is teaching the right thing from the right heart, he's encouraging them to be a voice to help squelch some of this problem that's out there in the community. You yourselves know, he says. You already know this. Paul had to leave town very quickly in Thessalonica. Remember that story? Paul came from Philippi. Paul got chased out of Philippi. He goes to Thessalonica. When he was in Thessalonica, he was only there for 3 weeks. He was there for 3 weeks, and then a group from Philippi came over and chased him out of Thessalonica, and he went on to Berea. There was a growing rumor that Paul left out of cowardice. And one of the things that Paul is going to have to address is that he was a self-serving coward that was just in it for the money. But he knows, these Christians know his true heart. They know his true heart. If you've been a teacher, if you've been a journey group leader, if you've been in a role that you have stepped into the burden of presenting the truth and you have caught the criticism, unfounded criticism that sometimes comes from that, you know what kind of encouragement you get from the people who know the truth about your heart, about the people who support you and who encourage you and who believe in you and who say that. And Paul, from the very first verse in this chapter, is saying, you know, brothers, you know me. You know where I come from. You know what my goals are. You know what's happening. And you are my strength. You are my defense. You are my encouragement. The other thing to remember is that Paul is not terribly concerned about his own reputation. Paul, in this book and in other books, he will say, I'm not interested in people's opinions about me. If I were all about, the approval of men, I would not be preaching the gospel anyway. He says, I'm not concerned about what people say about me. If he can say in one hand, I'm not concerned about what people say at me, why is he here saying, it's really important that you guys understand my motives are pure and my approach is good? Doesn't it seem like there's a little bit of a disconnect here? Why do you think it might be that he says both, my reputation is important and my reputation is not important? Why is that such an important point to Paul? Yep. You know what, Carl, if you were standing over my shoulder and reading the next line in my notes, you couldn't have. That was absolutely, in fact, he said it better than I wrote it in my notes. He's absolutely right. Paul's concern is not on a pride level. Paul doesn't care what people out in the community are saying about him on a personal level. But Paul is deeply concerned about the veracity of his ministry, the effectiveness of his ministry. If he is discredited, then the gospel he preaches can be discredited. If he's not a person of good reputation, then the message coming from him won't be received as a substantial and verifiable and truthful message. And so Paul is saying, it is important to me that my reputation not sully the gospel. I want to make sure people can. Now, what you think of me personally, I don't care. But what you think of me as a person presenting the gospel is important, because the gospel is what's important, not my own reputation. Yes? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And Lori put her finger right on it. That's really one of the tensions in this book, is the way Paul is consistently changing his audience from those, you know me. He says, you know me. And then he goes on to explain, here's what you need to know about me if you don't know me. Because there are people who are outside of that circle who don't have that understanding. And that's an important distinction.
Jeff, you know the people that chased Paul out,
Mm-hmm.
were they Jewish or were they Gentile?
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure.
If the Jews were chasing him out, the Gentiles would listen maybe to what the Jews were saying, and Paul's having to defend that.
I know that it started with the Jews. When you go back to Acts 17, they come into Thessalonica. His first stop was at the Jewish synagogue. He went on to explain. There were, in verse 4, some of them, that would be Jews. He's in the synagogue, at least the large number, persuaded. He goes on to mention at the end of that verse that there were a large number of Greeks as well. But when it talks about the mob, Well, you know what? Clarification may come in verse 5 of Acts 17, Roger. When the Jews became jealous. Now, there's no other mention through this of a group, but later on it does talk about the synagogue. So I think we are talking about Jews. Good point, Roger. That does help a distinction.
Paul was originally disputing the Christians, and now these Jews are saying, this guy's, now he's changed 180 degrees. We need to get rid of him.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a good point, Roger, and that's not something I'd gone back to look at, but you're right. It does seem that probably those people were Jews, which gives us some insight as to their attack. Like you said, he was on our side, now he's against us, so that's a big problem.
Don't need to hear that story.
No, you're right. The church at Thessalonica doesn't need the backstory on that. They just need to know there's a group that doesn't accept my apostleship, but you know better, so you help be my defense. You be the message that we present to them. I'm just going to go through this really quick because we'll pick up on this as we go through this book. But it is really remarkable. In this chapter alone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 different things that Paul defends himself against. And a cursory reading of this chapter, this is thankfully the work of Barclay, who did a great job of kind of pulling these threads out of this tapestry. The first comes in chapter 2, verse 2, and that's the accusation that Paul has a police record. This guy's a criminal. He's criminal. You can't trust him. That the accusation that they might have been placing against him was that he has a criminal record. He was imprisoned in Philippi. When he mentions Philippi, that would be like somebody getting up to preach a sermon and everybody in the audience is whispering, well, this is a convict. So he had to answer that. That Paul is delusional. He goes on later in this chapter to address Paul saying, I'm not preaching out of error. I'm not preaching out of error. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't just come up with this in my head. The accusation, Paul is preaching from impure motives. That word uncleanness, we'll talk about that more in just a moment, but that message of uncleanness is connected to a moral lack that often results or exposes itself in covetousness and greed. And he's coming to you because he wants money. He's trying to deceive people. We see this in verse 3, deceit. He's trying to deceive. His message is false, and it's predicated in falsehood. Not pleasing men, verse 4. He preaches to please others, not God. Paul has to address that. I'm not here to make you happy. I'm here to make God happy. Verse 5 and verse 9, this phrase, covetousness, cloak for covetousness, that Paul is in it for what he can get out of it. A common theme during these days. Missionaries were very commonly in the business of making money off of their missionary work. Paul only wants personal glory. Verse 6, we did not seek glory from men. Paul was in it for the status. He was in it for the accolades. Paul has to say, no, I'm not. And in verse 7, that Paul is something of a dictator, that Paul is a tyrant, that he wants to control every aspect of their life. And Paul says, no, I came to you gentle. I came to you in a gentle heart and a gentle way. In all of these, the thing that we see is what goes back in that early verse. Our coming to you was not in vain. It wasn't without recourse. It wasn't ineffective. It wasn't hollow and empty. It bore fruit. In the course of 3 weeks, Paul was able to establish a core group of Christians that grew and grew and grew into a sizable church, a force to be reckoned with in this community. And he did it over the course of 3 weekends. And it's a really remarkable thing when Paul says, look at where you are. This didn't just happen on accident. This just didn't happen in vain. This was something that God worked through and made something great happen. And that's his main defense against all these accusations. If it is from God, it's going to grow. If it's not from God, it won't. It has grown. Therefore, there's evidence that God's hand is with this. He goes on to recount those Philippi days and the challenges that he faced. Even after we had suffered before and spitefully retreated at Philippi, we talked last week about the fact that Paul came into this letter very dejected. Paul came into this letter very beaten down. He had faced challenge after setback after heartache, and the the report from Thessalonica that the church was thriving and doing well just brought all new energy to Paul. And he's reflecting on where he came from and what he was now experiencing. Roger brings up the Philippi, and that's such an important part of this. I think it's important for us to really understand that when Paul had arrived at Thessalonica, he was still, the wounds were still literally fresh. Paul had received a Roman flogging in Philippi, despite the fact that he was a Roman citizen and that never should have happened. He endured a Roman flogging, which killed many people. It was a brutal, brutal thing. This was not just, when I was a kid, I got whooped. This was not getting whooped. This was a beating to the point of, close to taking your life, that would have flayed his back open, that would have caused great injury. When he goes into Thessalonica, it's only days after receiving these whips, he would have still been bearing the wounds. These people knew what he had suffered. They saw literally with their own eyes what he had suffered. And here's something that we see following on with this. We were bold. We were bold. That word bold means to have confidence that extends itself verbally, demonstratively. It's a confidence that people can see in you. And a person who had been beaten, a person who had been ran out of town, a person who just continued to proclaim the gospel, proclaim the gospel, proclaim the gospel, regardless of all the conflict that he's facing, is a message of the kind of boldness that Paul demonstrates. Despite all the hardship, despite all the challenges, he continued to stay true to the course and continued to do the mission. I just got to tell you, I don't know where we would be today in face of this kind of persecution. We all like to say, well, I know that I would never, it would never stop me. I would like to think that, but I don't know. I don't know how I would do. I do know how Paul did. And I think that's a real testimony and an example for us. Verses 3 through 5. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanliness, nor was it in deceit. But we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. Even so we speak, not pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness. God is witness. He starts by saying, our exhortation, our teaching to you, our encouragement to you did not come from error. And this is something that I think should be an easy thing for us to understand. I want us to go back for just a moment to the resurrection of Jesus. At the time, there were 11 apostles, right? Because Judas had subsequently taken his life. If you track the lives of those 11 men from this point forward, 10 of them are going to die horrible deaths. One of them is going to die after a protracted exile and imprisonment. If they knew it was all made up, why on earth would they endure that? Why on earth would they endure what they endured if they knew in their hearts it's not even real? I mean, honestly, it doesn't take a great deal of cognitive, processing to look at this and go, that just doesn't make sense. If I know I made up a story, I am not going to die a horrible death for it. I know I'm not. So when Paul says it's not in error, Paul says, look at what I've suffered. Look at what I've endured. Look at what I've gone through. Look at the beatings and the stonings and the being chased from town. Would I do this if I knew it was all made up? That's just dumb. No, I wouldn't do that. So his first thing is, think about it. Why would I do this to myself if I know for a fact that it's all made up? Then he goes, uncleanliness. I mentioned this earlier, but this uncleanliness can be a matter of uncleanliness of spirit, or it can be uncleanliness of flesh. And so Paul is very ambiguous here. Was he being accused of being impure because of his actions? Or was he accused of being impure because of his spirit? the thing that I find interesting as I read all these commentaries about this is I more and more believe that Paul purposefully left it ambiguous here. All he had to do was put a little qualifying, not even a word, just a suffix on the end of that Greek word, and it would have told him, you are accusing me of being morally impure, or you are accusing me of being spiritually impure. But he doesn't. He leaves it ambiguous, and I think he's addressing all of those arguments. I think he's saying, you are accusing me of something that is untrue. I don't have moral impurity in my life. I don't have spiritual impurity in my life, and that's not what I'm preaching out of. Third, he says, deceit. I didn't come to you to fool you or trick you. And he gives evidence for that as we go through this chapter. I didn't come to you for an idea that I'm going to put together some kind of a concocted plan that's going to draw you in and suck you into my teachings. He didn't come to us from deceit. And here's where a little bit of remembering back 3 weeks ago is helpful for us. Remember, we talked about the city of Thessalonica is on the Egnatian Way. It's the biggest road outside of Italy during this time. It was the major thoroughfare of trade in the ancient world outside of Italy proper. And it is a massive melting pot. You got people from every different religion and culture and ethnicity and race and nationality that are all here. It is argued that there had not been, up to that point, a greater confluence of religious influences in one city than there was at Thessalonica at this time. It was wild. In fact, I pulled this out of a commentary. A staggering variety of religions and religion professionals in Thessalonica. In this city, you would find the worship of the gods of the Olympian pantheon, Apollo, Athena, Hercules, the native Greek mysteries, Dionysus, the Greek intellectual and philosophical traditions, Egyptian gods, Isis, Serapis, Anubis, as well as the Roman state cults and the Jewish people and the God-fearing Gentiles. 80% of the religious people in the world today come from 4 religions. 80%. They're Christian, some form of Christianity, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu. We live in a world that's largely dominated by 4 religions. This was a city that in it had literally more than 100. Not more than 100 churches, not little variations, entirely different religions. The other thing that's interesting about this time is that this was a time of missionary zeal. It's not just the Christians who are going all over the world teaching about their religion. This was a time of huge missionary zeal. And all of these religions were sending out missionaries. All of these religions were. We don't think of that. We don't typically think of these ancient religions as being so missionary-minded, but there was a period here where they really were. The distinction that Paul's making is, look at the way those people live their lives. Those are the people that are living unclean. Those are the people that are living covetous lives. The common situation with these missionaries from these different religions is they would roll into a town, they would take everything they could. They would extort large amounts of money from people. They would say, that if you want to be in good with the God, you've got to give me all these gifts and give me all this money and give me all this tribute. And then once they fleeced that city, they would go to the next city. And Paul said, look at the way I'm living my life and look at the way they're living their life. I'm not coming to you in error. I'm not coming to you in uncleanliness. I'm not coming to you in deceit. But look at how they're living. And look at the difference between our lives. It's really an interesting parallel that he's making there, and something that I think drives home his point very well. He says, we have been approved by God. He says, as we have been approved by God. This phrase is a very interesting phrase because this comes from the Greek system of government. In those days, if you were elected to an office, if you were appointed to an office, before you could take office, you actually had to go through an approval process. Even if you'd been elected. Even if you'd been elected by popular vote, you still had to go through a process to prove that you were up to the challenge. We could argue that today's government could use a little of that. That's a different argument, different discussion. The reality was they had to be approved. Paul is using a phrase they already know. Because in their government, you were elected, and then you were approved, and then you served. And he said, we were called by God, we were approved by God, and we serve God. And that's an important thing that they would have really picked up on and recognized. That's an important clarification. He goes on to say, we speak not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness. That phrase, flattering words, means to speak the truth from a wicked heart. We often will use flattery to describe something that's not true about somebody. We'll say something about someone that's not true, and we'll call that flattery. That's not what the Greek word was. The Greek word was that you spoke something that was true, but you did it with an ulterior motive. You did it to compliment them, not because they were worthy of praise, but because you wanted to get something out of it. I bet if we all think a little bit, we can kind of relate to that. The times that we butter up our boss a little bit, we say something, and it's not false. No, that's a true statement. Yeah, it's a true statement, but why are you saying it really? Are you really saying it just to compliment him, or are you really saying it because you've got an angle? You're trying to work. You're trying to get something out of it. Paul says, we didn't speak truth out of an improper heart. When we speak truth to you, we speak truth to you from a pure heart. And Paul had said some wonderful things about them. Paul is going to say some more wonderful things about them. And he wants them to understand, I'm not just buttering you up so that you'll approve of me and praise me and listen to me. I'm telling you the truth because you need to understand it. You need to understand where it comes from. Let me stop right there and see what kind of comments and thoughts you have. Anything in these first 5 verses that jumps out to you? I've always thought that Paul's letters to Timothy should be required reading for every preacher on a very, very regular basis. And I still believe that Paul's letters to Timothy are among the most poignant and powerful treatise to a person who would be a preacher that we have in Scripture. They're scary. They're somber. They're important. But the more I read 1 Thessalonians, the more I realize 1 and 2 Timothy isn't the only epistle that should be common, regular reading for anybody who teaches a class, who preaches sermons, who leads journey groups, who serves in ministry. Because the things that he talks about in this letter cut right to the heart of the kind of self-evaluation, self-reflection that we need to constantly keep in front of ourselves. Why am I doing this? What is the real purpose for this? What is it I'm getting out of this? What is motivating me to do this? What is the heart from which I present this? And how can I be sure that I'm doing it from the right heart? I do think it would serve all preachers and teachers well to reflect on those things regularly. Any thoughts? Yeah, Patty. You couldn't hear that. She's mentioning the end of verse 5, and it ends with the words, God is our witness. And what an incredible statement that should be. I remember as a child, my mom used to say, Jeffrey, if Jesus were sitting here at the table right now, would you say that? And I always thought to myself, well, of course not. But he's not, but he is.
That's something that's hereditary. It goes to all mamas.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah. And not just mamas, but daddies say it too. I think I've used those words before at our dining room table. God is our witness. I think Patty's really onto something important there. If we need a overarching standard to compare, if we need a ruler to lay down beside our motivation, if we need something to determine, why am I doing this? Am I doing this from the right reasons? Am I doing this in the right way? Am I doing this for the right purpose? Am I sharing the fullness of what I know to be true? We would be wise to, in every lesson, when we sit down to write our lesson plan, start at the very top by saying, God is my witness. He's watching. He's listening. He's attentive to what I'm going to say in this lesson. And it should bring a sobriety and a seriousness to that presentation. And I think that's really important. Yep. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I love that, God knows that we are but dust. He knows that. He knows that. And that right there is one of the great challenges that we have in Christianity, isn't it? That we are to strive for perfection, knowing that we will continually struggle. That we should always be striving, be perfect as He is be holy as He is holy. Knowing that we're going to fail, but knowing that we're striving towards that. And recognizing that God's grace and His mercy and His understanding of that, is something that He is cognizant of and working toward. Audrey, did you wave at me? Did you have a question? Okay. Anybody else? Anything on that? Great points. Patty, thanks for that. I think that really is a great kind of summation of that whole first 5-verse section, is if we can just really drive home that point. God is our witness. God is watching. He's the one that we're seeking to please. We got time. Let's do one more verse. We got 2 minutes. Verse 6. And we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. We didn't seek glory from you. We didn't seek glory from others. We weren't at it so that we could have people speak our praises. That wasn't the reason that we brought this message to you, and that's not why this is important. These pure motives are something that is really important. We started this lesson by talking about Paul is not interested in his own reputation. He's interested in the reputation of the gospel. Paul is not interested in his own status. He's interested in the status of his message. And there is a real important thing there. I believe very strongly that a preacher, a teacher, a Bible class teacher, a journey group leader, a person who is sharing the Bible with someone needs to be able to present it in a way that highlights its appeal, that makes it appealing, that makes it accessible, that provides a sense of allure to the person that is hearing the message without trying to artificially create something that the Bible already has. We don't need to make the message attractive. We need to unleash the attractiveness that's already there. And I think that when we focus on our delivery, our presentation, we're focused on, this is a lesson that people are going to walk out and they're going to go, man, what a great speaker, what a great teacher, what great illustrations, what great analogies, what great mastery of the language. Boy, he's really smart, she's really amazing. Those are not messages that are preaching the gospel. Those are messages that are building a reputation, that are seeking the praise of men. And in the same way that we would be wise to start our lesson with God's watching, it would also be really good to put at the top of that page, I'm not the goal. It's not about me. It's not about me. In fact, there's a very famous book in Christian literature that starts with the first page, the first words. It's not about you. And I think that that's something that we who teach and preach would be wise to be reminded of. You guys have had great comments today. Anything before we go? Well, thank you very much. We'll pick it up from there. We didn't get through 10 verses, but we got through 6. That's more than I expected. So life is good. We'll pick it up from there next week. Thanks.